"Somebody please help! They took my daddy!" The cry tore through the cold evening air, echoing off the metal walls of the gas station. Rain poured over the cracked asphalt, forming small rivers that carried oil and dust into the drains. Under the harsh white glow of the flickering lights, 7-year-old Maya Johnson sprinted barefoot across the parking lot. Her tiny feet slapped against the wet pavement, her thin dress clinging to her shivering body. Her voice trembled but did not break. A row of motorcycles stood under the awning, their engines rumbling like thunder. The men beside them wore leather jackets, patches, and heavy boots. Some looked up in surprise, others with curiosity. Conversations stopped, laughter died, and the only sound left was the steady beat of rain and the little girl's desperate sobs. The Road Devils Motorcycle Club had just stopped for fuel. Their leader, Jake Morrison, turned off his Harley and removed his helmet. His presence was commanding. Broad shoulders, weathered face, and arms marked by years of rough living. Yet his eyes were calm and thoughtful, the kind that had seen too much and still found room for mercy. He stepped forward slowly, his boots splashing through puddles, and crouched in front of the trembling child. "What happened, kid?" he asked, his tone steady, almost gentle. Maya tried to speak, but her breath came in sharp bursts. "The police took my dad," she said between hiccups. "They said he's a thief, but he's not. He didn't do anything wrong. Please, help him." The men behind Jake exchanged uneasy glances. People nearby whispered. "Cops don't arrest good people," someone muttered. Another said, "Why's she running to bikers?" Jake ignored the comments. He could see the terror in the girl's eyes, the kind that came from witnessing something no child should ever see. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his gloved thumb. "What's your daddy's name?" he asked. "David. David Johnson," she said softly. For a moment, Jake's expression changed. He recognized the name. David was the mechanic who had fixed the club's truck last year when no one else would. He had refused payment, saying, "Good engines deserve good hands." Jake had never forgotten that. David Johnson was an honest man in a dishonest world. Jake stood up, towering over the silent onlookers. His jaw tightened. "Don't worry, Maya," he said firmly. "We'll get your father back." The Road Devils looked at each other. They had seen Jake angry before, but never like this. He turned toward his bike, water dripping from his jacket, and the engines began to roar one by one. The bystanders stepped back as thunder rolled across the sky. They thought it was just a little girl crying in the rain, the narrator's voice whispered. They had no idea she had just summoned the storm. David Johnson had built his life around hard work and honesty. Every morning before sunrise, he opened the small auto shop at the corner of Maple and Fifth. The air always smelled of gasoline and rain, and his hands were permanently stained with grease. He was the kind of man who lent his tools to strangers and fixed engines for people who could not afford to pay. His wife, Diana, worked nights cleaning offices downtown, walking home long after the streetlights had gone out. Together, they raised their daughter, Maya, in a small weathered house that still managed to feel warm. Their life was not easy, but it was peaceful. On good days, David would pick up Maya from school on his old motorcycle, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around his waist. They would stop for ice cream before heading home to wait for Diana's call. Every night before bed, David tucked Maya in and told her the same words that had been passed down from his own father. "Truth is like oil, Maya. No matter how deep they try to bury it, it always finds its way to the top." She would nod sleepily, the words sinking into her heart like a quiet promise. But peace has a way of shattering when evil notices goodness. It happened on a Wednesday night. David stayed late at the auto shop to finish fixing a delivery truck that needed to be back on the road by morning. The street was nearly empty, just a few dim lights reflecting off puddles left from the rain. As he wiped his hands and prepared to close up, he heard car doors slam across the street. He looked up and saw two men he recognized, Detective Robert Carson and his partner, Tom Patterson. Both were leaning against an unmarked police car. A black SUV pulled up and 3 men in suits stepped out, each holding a small duffel bag. David froze when he saw what was inside, stacks of cash and small plastic packets filled with white powder. He did not make a sound, but Carson's head turned suddenly, his eyes locking with David's across the street. For a moment, everything went still. Then Carson smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. David knew he had seen something he was never supposed to see. By morning, the nightmare began. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of the Johnson home, just as Maya was pouring cereal into her bowl. The door burst open before Diana could even ask what was happening. Carson stepped in, his badge glinting under the morning light. "David Johnson," he barked. "You're under arrest for theft, drug possession, and obstruction of justice." David tried to explain. "This is a mistake. You know me. I run an honest shop." But Patterson was already pulling his arms behind his back, the cold metal of handcuffs snapping shut. Diana screamed, demanding to see a warrant, but Carson ignored her. He pushed David toward the door while neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Maya stood frozen behind the couch, clutching her father's old work gloves. Her small heart pounded as she watched the only man she trusted being dragged out like a criminal. David turned his head just once, his voice breaking. "It's all right, baby. Tell your mother I'll be home soon." But even he did not believe those words. The news spread quickly. "Local mechanic arrested in drug theft case," the papers said. The same reporters who had praised Carson's zero-tolerance policies now called him a hero again. They printed David's mugshot beside headlines that screamed guilt before the trial even began. Diana begged for answers, but no one would listen. Her calls to the police station were ignored, her pleas dismissed. Behind his polished reputation, Detective Robert Carson enjoyed every second of it. He was a man who thrived on control and fear. In public, he spoke at charity events and school assemblies about protecting the city. Politicians praised his courage. Businessmen invited him to golf clubs. But behind closed doors, he was the architect of half the city's corruption. He took bribes, planted evidence, and sold drugs confiscated from raids. Anyone who threatened his empire disappeared under the weight of false charges. That night, after hours of silence, Diana sat beside Maya on the couch. The little girl's eyes were swollen from crying. The rain beat against the window and the house felt emptier than ever. Maya finally whispered, "Mom, are they going to let Daddy come home?" Diana could not answer. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tight. As the storm outside grew louder, Maya remembered her father's words. She looked up at her mother and whispered, "Daddy said the truth always comes back. I'm going to go find it." And in that moment, the promise of a child became the spark that would set everything in motion. The truth, once buried under lies and power, had just found its voice. The morning sun crept over the rooftops, casting a pale light through the thin curtains of the Johnson home. Diana sat motionless on the couch, her hands trembling around a cup of cold coffee. She had not slept. The air felt heavy with helplessness, thick enough to choke on. Every call she made to the police station ended in silence or mockery. "Ma'am, if your husband is innocent, the court will decide that," they had said. But she knew the system would not save David. Maya watched her mother from the hallway. The little girl had barely eaten, her stomach knotted with fear, but something inside her refused to give up. She slipped quietly into her bedroom and opened her pink backpack. Inside, she placed her father's photograph, his work gloves, and the small silver keychain he had given her for good luck. She zipped it up, whispered a prayer, and tiptoed to the door. Outside, the streets were slick from the night's rain. The morning air was cool, but Maya's heart burned with determination. She walked first, then ran, her small legs carrying her past the bakery, past the park where she used to play with her father, and down the road that led to the highway. She remembered the loud bikes from the day before, the men who had looked scary but kind. If anyone could help, she thought, maybe it was them. It took nearly an hour before she found them. The Road Devils Motorcycle Club was gathered at the same gas station, polishing their bikes and checking their engines. The rumble of machines echoed like thunder, but Maya did not hesitate. She ran across the lot, waving her arms. "Mr. Jake!" she shouted, breathless. "Please, I need help." Jake Morrison turned, wiping grease from his hands. He looked surprised to see her, her hair messy and shoes soaked. Tank Rodriguez, the club's second-in-command, raised an eyebrow. Mickey Razor, tall and quiet with sharp eyes, paused mid-conversation. Diesel Grant leaned against his Harley, curious. Jake knelt down, concern etched into his weathered face. "Maya? Where's your mother?" "She's at home crying," Maya said, her voice breaking. "Nobody believes us." They said my daddy's bad, but he's not. The man who took him, his name's Carson. Please, you have to help us. You know my daddy. He fixed your truck." Jake's jaw tightened. The other men fell silent. Tank muttered, "Carson again. That snake's been untouchable for years." Jake stood slowly, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. The air around them changed. His expression hardened into something dangerous. Then, maybe it's time someone touched him. The road devils gathered around, forming a circle around Maya. To outsiders, they looked like a wall of leather and metal, but to her, they were safe. Jake's voice cut through the silence. "We've all seen what that cop does. We let it slide once, twice, too many times. Not this time. Not when he's hurting a good man and his little girl." Tank nodded, his deep voice steady. "So, what's the plan, boss?" Jake looked toward the horizon. "We start with someone who still believes in justice." An hour later, the roar of 6 motorcycles filled the highway. Maya sat in the middle of the convoy, safely tucked in a sidecar with a helmet almost too big for her head. They rode across the city to an office building with faded letters that read, "Martinez and Associates." Inside, behind a desk stacked with legal files, sat Maria Martinez, a sharp-eyed Latina lawyer in her 50s. She looked up in disbelief when she saw Jake walk in. "Jake Morrison," she said, standing. "I thought you traded law books for leather jackets." Jake smiled faintly. "Maybe, but today I need both." Maria crossed her arms. "This better be good." "It is," Jake replied. "A mechanic named David Johnson got arrested last night. Carson framed him for drugs." Maria's expression darkened. "Carson, again? That man is poisonous. You're serious about taking him on?" "Dead serious." "He framed a good man," Jake said. Maria exhaled, pacing behind her desk. "You realize how dangerous this is. He's got half the department under his thumb." Jake's eyes met hers. "Then let's make him wish he hadn't." There was a long pause. Then Maria nodded. "All right, I still have access to the city's digital archives. If Carson is moving money or manipulating cases, it will be there. Give me a few hours." Jake turned to his crew. "Tank, Mickey, Diesel, you're with me. We'll start digging around the Pine Street station. Someone there knows more than they're saying." Maria smiled faintly. Same Jake as always. Just in louder clothes. Before they left, Maya stepped forward, holding out her small hand. In her palm was a rainbow thread bracelet she had made herself. "For luck," she said softly. Jake crouched and took it gently. The colors were faded, but the threads were strong. He tied it around his wrist. "Luck's for gamblers," he said with a half-smile. "We've got truth on our side." Tank patted Maya's shoulder. "You're brave, kid. We'll bring your dad home." As they walked out, the sky began to darken again, clouds gathering above the city. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and slow, like the growl of an engine. Maya watched the bikers mount their Harleys, their leather jackets gleaming with rain. One by one, the engines ignited, and the roar shook the ground. The bystanders at the gas station looked on, whispering. "What's a bunch of bikers going to do against the police?" one man said. Maya watched the convoy disappear into the storm and whispered to herself, "A lot more than anyone thinks." Back inside her small home, Diana sat by the window, praying for a miracle. She did not know that her daughter had just found one. The storm outside thickened, lightning flashing across the sky as the road devils rode toward the heart of corruption. What had begun as a child's desperate plea was becoming something far greater, and as the thunder rolled, the city unknowingly braced for a reckoning. The truth was riding straight toward it, on roaring wheels and righteous fury. At the Pine Street police station, the walls smelled of stale coffee and sweat. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glare over the interrogation room. David Johnson sat handcuffed at the metal table, his wrists sore and bruised. The hours had stretched into eternity. His reflection in the mirrored wall looked unfamiliar. Tired eyes, split lip, and the kind of weariness that came from knowing the truth was no defense. Detective Robert Carson sat across from him, rolling a pen between his thick fingers. His partner, Tom Patterson, leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. Carson's smirk had not left his face since the questioning began. "Sign the confession." "David," Carson said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "you'll do 2 years instead of 10. You think anyone's going to believe a broken mechanic over me?" David raised his head slowly. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You might wear a badge, Carson, but you're no cop. You're a criminal with paperwork." The words hit like a slap. Carson's smirk vanished and his face twisted with rage. He slammed his fist on the table, sending the pen rolling to the floor. "You want to play tough? Fine. When your wife loses her job and your kid ends up in foster care, remember that you had a choice." Before he could speak again, another voice came from the doorway, calm, deep, and unmistakably defiant. "Funny. That's exactly what I was going to say." The room froze. Every head turned toward the door. Jake Morrison stood there, flanked by Tank Rodriguez, Mickey Razor, and Diesel Grant. Behind them, Maria Martinez stepped forward, holding a thick folder tucked beneath her arm. Rain dripped from Jake's jacket onto the tiled floor, leaving small dark spots that mirrored the tension in the air. Carson's eyes narrowed. "A biker lawyer," he scoffed. "You've got to be kidding me." Jake walked forward, calm but deliberate. "Not kidding," he said, placing the folder on the table in front of Carson. "Open it." Carson glared at him. "And what's this supposed to be?" "A court order," Jake said, "for the last 6 months of surveillance footage from the Oak Street office building." Carson hesitated, then flipped open the folder. His smirk faltered. Inside were neatly arranged documents, stamped and sealed with official insignias. Bank C records, surveillance photos, and signatures bearing the unmistakable seal of federal authorization. "You can fake paperwork," Carson muttered, his voice faltering. Jake's lips curved slightly. "Not federal signatures." Maria stepped forward, her tone sharp as a blade. "And, by the way, your own police chief turned over evidence for immunity." The room went silent. Patterson straightened from the wall, his face pale. "What are you talking about?" Maria tossed another sheet onto the table. "Chief Thompson," she said, tapping the signature at the bottom of the document. "He's been cooperating with federal investigators for weeks. Turns out he got tired of cleaning up your mess." Carson's hands began to shake. "You're bluffing." Jake tilted his head. "Then maybe you should ask the gentleman standing behind you." The door opened again. 3 men in suits entered, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent light. One of them spoke firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Detectives Robert Carson and Tom Patterson, you are under arrest for corruption, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice." The color drained from Carson's face. His hand twitched toward his holster, but Tank was faster. In one smooth motion, he reached forward, pulling the weapon from Carson's belt and sliding it across the table. "Careful," Tank said, his deep voice steady. "You might hurt yourself," Patterson stammered. "You can't just walk in here." Maria interrupted coldly. "We can, and we did." The agents stepped forward. Patterson's hands rose, trembling in surrender. Carson sat still, his mouth open but no sound coming out. The tension broke when the hallway filled with hurried footsteps. The door burst open. Again, and a small voice cried out, "Daddy!" Maya ran into the room, her small hand clutching her mother's. Diana Johnson followed close behind, tears streaming down her face. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. David stood, his wrists trembling as an agent unlocked the handcuffs. The metal clicked open, and for the first time in days, he felt air rush into his lungs. He fell to his knees as Maya threw her arms around him. "Daddy, I found them," she sobbed. "They're good bikers." David pulled her close, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Every officer in the room, every clerk in the hallway, watched in silence. The man they had mocked as a criminal now stood free, his innocence undeniable. The same badge that had condemned him now belonged to the men being led away in handcuffs. Carson, red-faced and trembling, tried to stand. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You're all the same. Trash and leather. No one will ever believe you." Jake turned to him slowly, his gaze steady and cold. "I think they will." He picked up a file from the table and held it out to one of the agents. "Every transaction, every payment, every bribe, It's all here. You tried to bury the truth under your money and power, but you forgot something important." He stepped closer, his voice low but powerful. "You tried to bury an honest man, but you forgot. Mechanics know how to dig." Carson lunged forward, but Tank and Mickey stepped in, blocking him. Patterson lowered his head in shame. As the agents escorted the two corrupt detectives out, the station erupted with whispers. Officers who had once admired Carson now turned away, unwilling to meet his eyes. The myth of his heroism was crumbling in real time. Jake turned back to David, offering his hand. "You all right, brother?" David nodded slowly, gripping it tight. "I owe you everything." Jake shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. You owe that little girl over there. She's the reason we found you." Maya smiled through her tears, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Diana allowed herself to breathe. Maria gathered the remaining documents and looked toward Jake. "You know this is going to be on every news channel by tonight." Jake smirked. "Good, let them see what happens when the people they call criminals decide to fight back." Outside, rain still poured, washing the grime from the streets. As the agents drove off with Carson and Patterson, the flashing red and blue lights reflected on the puddles like tiny sparks of justice. Inside the station, silence settled again, but this time it was different. It was not fear. It was respect. Jake turned to leave, motioning for his crew to follow. Maya tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Jake?" He crouched down, meeting her eyes. "Thank you for saving my daddy." He smiled softly. "You saved him first, kid. You just needed someone to listen." As they walked out into the rain, engines roaring to life once more, the echoes of justice followed them. The storm that had begun with a child's cry had ended with thunder in the hearts of every man who had doubted her. The air outside the Pine Street police station was electric. The rain had stopped, but the storm's memory lingered in the gray clouds that hung low above the city. Flashing red and blue lights painted the wet pavement, mixing with the glare of cameras and the murmurs of an astonished crowd. News vans lined the street, their antennas pointed skyward as reporters elbowed for position. Neighbors who once avoided the Johnson family now stood in solidarity, watching history unfold in front of them. Even officers from other precincts had come out, some still wearing their uniforms, their faces a mixture of disbelief and quiet relief. At the center of it all stood Detective Robert Carson, his hands cuffed behind his back. His expensive watch had been removed, his shirt untucked, and his once commanding voice reduced to muttered curses. The man who had walked these steps like a king now stumbled down them under the weight of his own downfall. As the FBI agents guided him toward the waiting car, flashes erupted from cameras. Reporters shouted questions, their voices colliding into chaos. "Detective Carson, do you deny the allegations? Is it true you framed innocent people for money? How long has this been going on?" Carson ignored them all, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ground, and then a shadow moved beside him. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his boots splashing in a puddle as he closed the distance between them. For a moment, the crowd hushed, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jake leaned in close enough for only Carson to hear. His voice was low, steady, and final. "You said people like us never win. Well," he paused, locking eyes with the disgraced detective, "maybe you've been arresting the wrong kind of people." Carson tried to turn away, but Jake's words landed like a hammer blow. The FBI agents opened the car door, pushing the former detective inside. For the first time in his career, Carson sat in the back seat of a cruiser, on the wrong side of justice. Jake straightened and stepped back. The crowd erupted into questions. A young reporter with a microphone pushed her way through, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Mr. Morrison, how did you pull this off?" Jake turned toward her, rain still dripping from his jacket. His expression was calm but unyielding. "Simple," he said. "We just remembered that justice isn't about titles. It's about people brave enough to fight for it." The words carried through the air, cutting through the noise. The reporter lowered her mic, stunned into silence. For a brief moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate. A few feet away, David Johnson stood with Diana and Maya, surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike. The handcuffs that had marked him a criminal hours ago were gone, replaced by the embrace of his family. His rough mechanic's hands trembled as he cupped his daughter's face. "You did it, Maya," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved me. Maya shook her head, her small fingers still wrapped around Jake's hand. "No, Daddy, they did." Jake looked down at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She's wrong, David. You raised her right. That's what I did it." Diana wiped her tears and pulled Maya into her arms. The cameras caught the moment. A mother holding her child, the symbol of love and resilience against corruption. "You found the right people, baby," Diana said softly. Maya's face lit up through her tears. Daddy always said truth finds its way. And in that instant, the crowd, hardened bikers, cautious neighbors, and skeptical reporters, felt something rare and pure: belief. Tank Rodriguez stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He leaned toward Mickey Razor, murmuring, "Guess we're the good guys today." Mickey smirked. "Maybe we always were." The road devils stood together in silence, the rumble of their motorcycles in the distance like a heartbeat waiting to start again. For years, they had been seen as outlaws, men who lived outside the law, feared and misunderstood. But on that street, under the gray sky, they were something different. They were symbols of justice the city had forgotten it needed. A reporter turned her microphone toward Diana. "Mrs. Johnson, what will you do now?" Diana blinked, her eyes glistening. "Go home," she said softly. "Hold my family, and then make sure no other mother goes through what I did." Her words drew quiet nods from the crowd. The cameras zoomed in on her face, the face of a woman who had been broken and rebuilt in the same night. As the FBI cars drove away, taking Carson and Patterson into custody, the sound of engines began to rise again. The road devils mounted their bikes, Jake at the front, Tank and Mickey behind him. Jake revved the engine once, then looked back at David, Diana, and Maya. "You three take care of each other," he said. David nodded, his arm around his wife and daughter. "You never need anything fixed. You know where to find me." Jake grinned. "I'll hold you to that." The engines roared, echoing through the streets like thunder made of redemption. The crowd watched as the road devils rode off down the highway, leaving behind the flashing lights, the cameras, and the chaos. For the first time in a long while, the city felt lighter. Justice had not come from a courtroom or a politician's speech. It had come from courage, from a little girl who believed in her father, from bikers who refused to look away, and from a truth too stubborn to stay buried. As Maya watched the bikes disappear into the horizon, she whispered one last time, "Thank you." And somewhere deep in the distance, Jake Morrison raised a hand from his handlebars, the rainbow thread bracelet around his wrist catching the light, a silent promise that justice would always keep riding. 6 months passed, and the city was no longer the same. The shadows that had once hung over its streets began to fade, replaced by something brighter, something that felt like hope. The scandal that had rocked the Pine Street Police Department had made national news. Corruption was no longer a rumor whispered in dark corners. It was a fact carved into public record. Robert Carson stood at the center of it all, now stripped of his badge, title, and arrogance. In a federal courtroom crowded with reporters and former colleagues, he heard the words he never thought he would. 15 years in federal prison. His face, once smug and untouchable, was pale as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. There was no applause, only silence, a silence heavier than any gavel. He was led away, his empire of lies crumbling behind him. His partner, Tom Patterson, took the stand days later, voice shaking as he exposed everything: names, payoffs, hidden accounts, and every dirty officer who had fed off the same corruption. His cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, but his testimony destroyed what was left of Carson's power. One by one, other officers fell, their badges tarnished, their reputations erased. The city's police chief resigned, and a federal task force rebuilt the department from the ground up. For the Johnson family, justice finally felt real. Diana Johnson won a $2.3 million settlement for her husband's wrongful arrest and the trauma their family endured. But she did not waste a single cent on revenge or luxury. Instead, she founded Clean Start Services, a cleaning company that hired single mothers who had been forgotten by society, women who had been told no one too many times. Within months, the company grew beyond expectations. Clients praised her honesty and compassion, and every employee carried her spirit of resilience. When asked why she started the business, Diana simply said, Because everyone deserves a second chance that isn't stained by someone else's corruption. David Johnson returned to his auto shop, but it was no longer just a business. It became a classroom for young mechanics, especially boys from rough neighborhoods who needed guidance. He taught them how to rebuild engines, but more importantly, how to rebuild their lives. On the shop wall, he hung a framed photo of Jake Morrison and the Road Devils with a handwritten note. Integrity is the only part no one can replace. Maya, now 9, had grown taller, her laughter returning little by little. Every weekend, she visited the Road Devils' garage. The bikers had become like uncles to her, Tank teaching her how to polish chrome, Mickey showing her how to balance a wrench, and Diesel letting her help change the oil on Jake's Harley. She wore a tiny black leather vest stitched with the club's insignia and a small patch below it that read, "Justice rides with us." Sometimes, she would climb onto Jake's motorcycle while he sat beside her, pretending to steer as the sun dipped low. "One day," Jake would say, "this world's going to need people like you again." And she would smile, replying, "Then I'll be ready." The town, inspired by the story that had spread across the country, decided to honor the people who had reminded everyone what courage looked like. On the side of the old courthouse, artists painted a massive mural. Maya standing beside Jake and the Road Devils, the sky above them bright and endless. At the bottom, in bold white letters, it read, "Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they ride." Visitors stopped to take pictures every day. Some smiled, some cried, but all of them left believing that justice, no matter how delayed, was still possible. And as a narrator's voice would later say in a television documentary that covered the story, they said bikers could not bring justice. But when the law forgot its duty, they remembered theirs. Every time the engines of the Road Devils echoed through the streets, people turned to listen, not in fear, but in gratitude. The thunder of their bikes had become a promise, a reminder that truth never dies quietly. The sun dipped low over the highway, turning the wet asphalt into a ribbon of gold. Jake Morrison stood beside his Harley, watching as Maya and her parents drove away in their small car. Their laughter echoed faintly in the distance, warm and free. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the little rainbow thread bracelet, the one Maya had given him that stormy day. With steady hands, he tied it around his handlebar, the colors glowing softly in the fading light. "You did good, kid," he murmured, his voice rough but tender. The engines of the Road Devils roared to life behind him as he spoke the words that would stay with him forever. They tried to silence an honest man, but the truth was spoken through his daughter. They tried to bury justice, but it came roaring back on steel and thunder. Because sometimes, the heroes we fear are the only ones brave enough to do what is right. If this story reminded you that real justice does not come from power, but from courage, like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another little voice is crying for help, waiting for heroes who dare to listen.